In November 1918, the guns fell silent, but the bill for the war did not. Millions were demobilizing, economies were exhausted, and people wanted someone to blame. An armistice is a pause, not a settlement. Leaders now had to decide what justice would look like, and whether justice meant punishment, prevention, or reconciliation. France had been invaded, its industrial regions damaged, and its population bled. Clemenceau's priority was simple. Germany must never be able to do this again. Britain wanted punishment and stability at once. Voters demanded payback, but Europe also needed trade, or recovery would collapse for everyone. Wilson arrived with a vision: transparent diplomacy, self-determination, and a League of Nations to replace revenge with rules. Italy had fought with expectations of territorial rewards. Orlando came to Paris to secure promises and found the table crowded with stronger voices. The war shattered old empires and left new states and border claims everywhere. Peacemakers weren't just ending a war, they were attempting a full map redesign. Across Europe, hunger and anger fueled revolutions and strikes. Leaders feared that if peace took too long, or felt too unfair, governments could fall before ink dried. The Paris Peace Conference was not a neutral court. It was dominated by the victors, and the defeated were mostly excluded from shaping the terms. Everyone claimed they wanted lasting peace, but lasting meant different things. For some it meant weakening Germany, for others, building institutions, for others, balancing power. Paris filled with diplomats, translators, journalists, and lobbyists. Every hallway conversation was a negotiation, because every detail could change borders, money, or pride. Wilson feared another world war if nations stayed trapped in secret deals. Clemenceau feared Germany's return, so every clause felt like a shield. Self-determination sounded simple. Let peoples choose their governments. But mixed populations and strategic rail lines made choice complicated. Maps can't easily separate neighbors. France wanted buffers, physical and political, between itself and Germany. Demilitarized zones, occupation, and guarantees all came up because fear demanded distance. Lloyd George wasn't negotiating only with other leaders, he was negotiating with voters back home. Newspapers demanded a hard peace, and elections made patience expensive. Reparations were framed as compensation for damage and loss, but they also became a way to limit Germany's future power. Allies wanted a legal basis to demand payments, but any clause that looked like, "You admit you caused this," would land as humiliation. Wilson pushed for the League as the treaty's cornerstone. Skeptics warned a league without universal commitment would be speeches without enforcement. Negotiations dragged on, and impatience grew. The longer the talks took, the more leaders defaulted to simple, forceful solutions. By spring 1919, the treaty's shape emerged. Confidence mixed with exhaustion, and Germany waited outside for a verdict it couldn't rewrite. Germany expected negotiation. Instead, it was largely handed terms to accept or reject. That difference mattered. Negotiated peace can be owned. Imposed peace becomes a grievance. Many Germans called the treaty a diktat, an order, not an agreement. Even Germans who knew they had lost still resented being treated as if they had. Germany's new democratic government inherited defeat, revolution fears, and a collapsing economy. Signing might save lives by preventing renewed war, but it could also destroy political legitimacy. Even among the victors, the treaty was controversial. Some warned that crushing Germany would breed revenge, while others demanded a hard peace. Territories and borders became chips on the table. Some changes followed national lines. Others followed strategy ports, rivers, coal basins, and buffer zones. Disarmament clauses were meant to prevent Germany from rebuilding an army that could invade again. But disarmament is hard to enforce forever, especially if neighbors rearm. Reparations were not only a financial question, they were a political thimble. Too low looked like betrayal of the dead. On May 7, 1919, the Germans were presented with the treaty draft. They could submit written objections, but the structure of the deal was already set. German delegates protested the war responsibility language, the territorial losses, and the sheer weight of payments. But protests without bargaining power rarely change outcomes. By June, it came down to an ultimatum: sign or face consequences. A peace designed under ultimatum logic teaches the defeated a lesson: obey now, remember later. Germany lost territory and all overseas colonies. New borders created minorities overnight. When borders shift, daily life becomes paperwork. New laws, new languages, new authorities. One symbolic change was Alsace-Lorraine returning to France. For France, it was restoration. For Germany, a public loss that stung. To rebuild Poland and give it access to the sea, borders carved corridors and created friction that left Germany feeling divided. Coal was the energy of the era. Control of coal regions like the Saar meant leverage over industry and recovery. The treaty limited Germany's military forces and equipment. Supporters called it prevention. Critics warned it could create humiliation without true security if enforcement faded. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized and partly occupied, acting as a security buffer for France and Belgium. For Germans living there, it felt like sovereignty. Reparations were meant to pay for damage, but also carried a moral message: the loser pays. In practice, payments would collide with inflation, budgets, and political anger. Article 231 stated that Germany accepted legal responsibility for the losses and damage caused by the war. It was meant as a legal foundation for reparations. Wilson insisted the League of Nations be woven into the settlement. The logic was systems first. Disputes should go through rules and councils, not trenches. Versailles tried to do 4 things at once: punish, compensate, prevent, and redesign the map. Those goals don't naturally align. The signing date, June 28, 1919, carried symbolism. It matched the anniversary of the Sarajevo assassination that triggered the war. Symbols can feel like justice to one side. The treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, turning diplomacy into theater where winners watched and losers signed. Germany's representatives signed, many believing they had no real alternative. The act ended the formal state of war, but it did not end the emotional war. The treaty would enter into force in early 1920, turning promises into enforceable obligations. From that point, payments, inspections, and new borders became daily reality. Many in the victors' countries felt relief that the war was formally over and that sacrifice now seemed justified. In Germany, the treaty felt unfair and humiliating. Losses, payments, and the responsibility clause became a wound extremists kept reopening. Myths spread fast after defeat. The stab in the back story redirected anger inward, turning pain into suspicion and political poison at home. Wilson won the League's inclusion, but the U.S. Senate refused to ratify Versailles. America stayed out, leaving the League weaker from the start. A peace has 2 forms: what it says and how it feels. In Germany, Versailles read like punishment, not security. Resentment can be stored like coal, quiet, compact, waiting for a spark. Versailles ended one war, but stocked fuel for the next. Reparations turned into a long-term schedule of payments and deliveries. Schedules sound manageable, until politics and economics change faster than calendars. As Germany struggled with obligations and instability, its currency began to wobble. When money loses meaning, trust erodes, wages, savings, and contracts all become arguments. Every payment created pain, and pain created political backlash. Backlash made cooperation harder, which made enforcement harsher, and the loop kept spinning. Britain and France often disagreed on enforcement. France wanted certainty and security. Britain feared economic collapse spreading across Europe. When payments fell behind, occupation and control of industrial areas became enforcement tools. But occupation can feel like humiliation, and humiliation makes compliance politically toxic. Europe's recovery depended on loans, trade, and stable currencies. Even victors needed money to rebuild. A punitive peace can still require cooperation, an uncomfortable truth. The League of Nations could debate and mediate, but without unified enforcement, it often produced speeches instead of action. Because the Weimar government signed the treaty, many citizens blamed democracy itself for humiliation. When new regimes inherit disasters, they often inherit hatred too. Attempts were made to restructure payments and stabilize the economy through international plans and loans. Stability returned for a time, but it created dependency on foreign credit. The treaty could be enforced on paper, but it could not be enforced in hearts. Without trust, every clause becomes a battlefield of interpretation. In the 1920s, politicians learned that anger could be harvested. If you can point to a villain, Versailles, bankers, outsiders, you can turn pain into votes. Veterans across Europe carried wounds and expectations, and many felt that peace failed to repay what the war had taken. When economies crash, moderate politics looks weak. People start choosing leaders who promise simple solutions, strong enemies, and dramatic reversals. Most citizens never read the treaty. They absorbed it through stories, posters, speeches, jokes, and slogans. And stories can sharpen resentment faster than facts. Extremists promised to tear up Versailles and restore pride. It was a clean promise, and clean promises are attractive in dirty times. As Germany pushed against restrictions, neighbors debated how to respond. If one side breaks rules, others stop trusting rules, and the system reverts to power politics. By the early 1930s, depression and political violence shook Germany. When institutions feel slow, people accept dangerous speed from demagogues. Germany began rearming and experimenting around restrictions, often disguised as police or civil programs. Once rearmament starts, it becomes a momentum problem. Stopping is politically costly. When Germany marched into the Rhineland in 1936, weak response taught a lesson. Rules without enforcement become optional. Once leaders learned they could break Versailles with limited consequences, ambition grew. The treaty had become not a guardrail but a ladder, something to climb past. Versailles did not mechanically cause World War II like a simple domino, but it helped create conditions, resentment, instability, enforcement problems that extremists could exploit. A treaty needs legitimacy to last. If a large population experiences it as humiliation, they will look for leaders who promise revenge, even at terrible cost. Diplomacy writes rules. Economics tests them daily. If people can't eat or save, they stop believing in the system that promised peace. Enforcement that is strict one year and absent the next teaches cynicism. Consistency matters more than severity, because it shapes expectations. It's easy to judge the treaty's harshness from a distance. In 1919, fear was close. Ruined towns, lost families, and the memory of invasion. Humiliation does not fade like statistics. It becomes a story repeated for years, waiting for a leader willing to weaponize it. Could there have been a better settlement? Maybe, but every alternative had costs too, and leaders were choosing under fear and exhaustion. The treaty did end the war officially and attempted to create a new international order. It also redrew borders and set up mechanisms for arbitration. Between 1919 and 1939, Europe lived inside Versailles' shadow. Economic shocks, political extremes, and repeated tests of enforcement turned shadow into darkness. The Treaty of Versailles sought safety through punishment and systems, but peace only lasts when people believe it is fair.